Hello everybody and welcome to a bonus hobby cheating video. And I want to take a little time to talk about studying art styles. Um, this video comes out of a recent trip I took to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which is a really awesome museum, and I would certainly recommend it if you are ever over in the Netherlands or in Amsterdam and you want to see just really some absolutely stunning art. Van Gogh is one of my more uh, favorite artists from sort of historical artists, and his work is supremely fascinating to me because if you look at his output, which was all created over a relatively short time, that is to say, his art is largely from basically a 7 to 8 year period, to be generous, out of a particular period in his life. So more or less between 1882 and 1889. Toward the end of his life, he did go into overdrive and just produce an absolute ton of paintings. I think one of the statistics from the end of his life is he did something like 75 paintings in as many days, which is madness. Um, but the other thing that's fascinating about Van Gogh is that he was always seeking after change. If you look at his art, it's unbelievably evolutionary. He changes a lot. But we're not going to look at the history of his art today, although we could. I could do a whole retrospective just on him, and I'm quite sure that actually, if you search around on YouTube, you'll find that. Instead, when I was there, there's an interesting comparison between two pieces of art. It came out around the same time. Both are owned by the museum, and I found them to be a fascinating contrast. And I thought it'd be a really interesting video to talk through. I'm doing this one as a bonus because my suspicion is it's not a miniature painting technique and people may not find it as interesting, but I find it really fascinating and I thought this would be a great discussion to have. So let's get into it. So these are the two paintings. The left is obviously by Van Gogh, vase with Chinese asters and phlox from 1886. On the right we have Henri Fantin-Latour, flowers from Normandy, 1887. So I love these two paintings hanging next to each other, being sort of juxtaposed against each other. The first thing to note is that in the museum they are placed more or less adjacent to each other and meant to contrast. So whoever the curator is is probably thinking along much the same lines as I am here, although I don't know if they have the same opinions. For me, I absolutely love the piece on the left. I love Van Gogh's piece, and I could not care less about about the piece on the right. And as I looked at both of them, I sort of stood there staring at them and really deeply thinking on why the left one provoked such an immediate reaction from me, like a strong emotional reaction of really enjoying this painting. I stared at it for quite a long time, and why I basically moved by the one on the right and didn't give it a second glance. And I think there's something to extract here about from this about the way we look at painting miniatures and creating art in the miniature form. So let's just talk basics here first. So let's make some relatively objective statements as much as we can when we're dealing with art. So Van Gogh's piece is much more monotone. It leans much heavier into the red spectrum. Red and orange are used to large degrees. He also mixes in various whites to go into pink all over the place, so we can see a lot of that. I will say this picture here is has been brought up and sort of touched up in color, because when you see this piece in reality, the greens are a little more subdued and the yellows are a little more bright, the three yellow flowers up top. So I suspect this is, as with all digital photography of art, there is some color correction to make sure it reads on the internet. But nonetheless, the piece still communicates. It has some very nice, very deep, very strong shadows. I would direct everybody to look at the sort of dark areas, both in the vase, the shadow this incredible shadow that the vase is casting. Like, there is no reality where the vase cast that shadow. That looks like Cthulhu is coming up behind the vase, right? Just this unbelievable darkness hides behind the vase. The piece itself has brushstrokes everywhere. Like, that is to say, you can see massive visible brushstrokes, as was very common for Van Gogh's art. He used extremely thick paint. He had visible brushstrokes everywhere. This is a commonality amongst most of his pieces throughout his output. And the the color palette and placement has a lot more like both life and death to it, I would say. We're probably drifting a bit into the subjective here, but what I mean by that is he has placed a lot more wilted flowers near the bottom, petals and things around the base. In general, when you're doing this, like, a disconnected flower is death, and so on and so forth. His flowers don't all look perfect. Many of them are in odd shapes or odd ways. They're missing petals. There's uh, an almost disharmony to the nature of the flowers he portrays here. Okay, let's now contrast that to Henri's piece on the right, where everything is quite smooth. Like, this is a wonderful piece of and obviously. Oh, I should also state these are obviously different styles of art, right? Duh. I mean, I don't think I'm really sort of letting the cat out of the bag on that one. Obviously, the left is much more impressionistic, whereas the right is much more realistic. Anyway, so we see a much smoother application of paint. Things are much more balanced. Like, look at the table and look how much more squared that piece is, right? Like, we have this very sort of forced perspective. The shadow is so much softer and cast by this sidelong light. Like, we have a very obvious, very directed light source. Everything is very smooth. It touches a lot more colors, though it leans a lot heavier on green. It uses a lot more neutral colors, just to get the dominance of the background and the table being these highly neutral colors. But the flowers themselves, look at how much more there is in the sort of white and very, very desaturated ochre and yellow tones, right? But then we have individual pop flowers that are purple and bright red and bright pink, and we have a couple orange flowers and so on and so forth. So we cover a lot more of the spectrum on the right. The flowers look much more full. There's much more of a focus on life, on an explosion of life. That is to say, both in the fact that the vase is clear and we can see the root structure, which increases the amount of green in the photo, which when we look at nature, we take green to mean life. Like, just, you can't help it. Walk outside and look at a concrete field, like a parking lot, or look at a field of mud. Now contrast that to a field of grass, like in The Sound of Music. Which one feels more alive to you subconsciously without you even needing to, you don't have to form that thought. It's just there, right? Okay. So I looked at these two pieces. And as I said, I really thought Van Gogh's piece is infinitely more interesting to me. And I sat there and tried to unpack why that is. If art were to be judged on any dimension of realism, which is where we tend to judge our miniature painting, right? Like, when we paint miniatures, we're usually trying to replicate reality. We very much have like a the more real, the better type of perspective. So we're trying to replicate, the placement of light. We're trying to compositionally balance things and make colors more interesting and more evenly composed around the miniature. We're trying to make sure everything is smooth, and so it doesn't even look like paint. We want it to look like reality, not like a painted miniature, right? So by any of those dimensions that we would evaluate miniature painting, Henri's piece would be far better. It is clearly an objectively better example of all of those things, right? And yet, I couldn't care less about it. It provokes nothing in me. It is as cold as anything else I would ever see. And part of that is probably because, excuse me, part of that is probably because it does just feel almost rote. Now that's unfair, okay, in the extreme, because I almost feel like that sounds like I'm attacking the piece. The reality is I couldn't paint that, right? It's a beautiful piece. Like, set aside for a moment this whole discussion, and certainly we must admit that this is a wonderful capture of all these different types of flowers, and that Latour would like really did a wonderful job here with capturing this vase of flowers, of having these soft, subtle tones in each petal, and that shouldn't be undercut. So what I'm not talking about here is the evaluation of technical skill, because I have to believe that the piece on the right took longer than the piece on the left. I don't know that. And I suppose how fast artists paint is, a very subjective evaluation. But when I think of like effort expended, generally copying reality is very difficult. So let's just lay that flat. I am in no way meaning to insult this piece. It's a beautiful piece of art nonetheless. What I'm talking about here is the emotional resonance. What sticks with me? When I walked out of this museum, there were a few pieces of Van Gogh that really stuck in my mind. Like, I mean, it's a museum of hundreds of pieces of art. And in the end, you probably walk out with like 3 or 4 that really stick in your mind, right? And this is one of them. So, what I love about the one on the left, and what I think is an interesting lesson for us to learn, is that, the Impressionists in general were much less concerned with sort of this accuracy of realism. It was a step away from that, of course, hence the nature of hence the, the entire term, right? And it was more about trying to capture the emotion, the feeling, and all that. I mean, again, I'm sure you can go watch 100 videos on like the history of Impressionism, and I'm not an art scholar, to be clear. I'm just talking about how this affects me. Art is always personal, right? And what I love about it is it's the raw way it uses all of its colors and lay something out so striking and so bare and so sharply. The contrast in the piece is so massive that it does feel like it's not trying to capture reality, but like it's trying to capture something more, something different. Like it's actually trying to capture something about the way he felt that day while painting it, or the feeling he got when he looked at it. There is and this overwhelming use of like warm colors with this shocking red background, these like violent perpendicular brushstrokes, right? Like really look at the background and notice how he's just like, moving horizontally and moving vertically, just like it feels like a crosshatch bamboo almost back there, right? And it's so much more striking because of all of these reasons, because it feels more raw, more emotional, more contrasting, more shocking. So I think that, to me, the translation here, not to just, I know I've run on for a long time on this, but I really do love this painting, is that we shouldn't judge our miniature painting. I see no reason why miniature painting has to be different. It's always going to be more focused on realism. That's the nature of the thing. I don't think tomorrow we're all going to start, doing impressionistic takes on our miniatures or something like that, right? We're not going to be Cezanne doing these sort of like bright, colorful interpretations of a space marine 100 times over and over again. I don't think that's where we're going as a hobby. The hobby is a hobby. It's, there's very few professional artists in the miniature painting game vis-a-vis the total percentage of people painting miniatures, right? And so this is always something where we're we're trying to do the basic thing, get our miniatures painted to generally play with them. A few of us are trying to compete with them. But even so, most judging and evaluation is done with the just off the starting block assumptions that being able to capture realism and execute your paint in a technical fashion has an innate value to it, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But what I want to take from this, from my own personal work, and what it made me think about, was how much we could, especially on those pieces that we're wanting to try hard, where we want to be something special for us personally, right? Damn the torpedoes, as it were, like something that I'm doing for me is to be less afraid of trying to be more bold and defy sort of the standard traditional institutional wisdom. Banshee famously has the F smoothness movement, and this is as anti smoothness as you can get, right? But the point being is that to be more bold, to paint more bravely, to not worry as much about these details, but to do something that speaks to you and might speak to others. This it would generally be bad form to have a almost completely monotone miniature with just a few contrasting colors, like the few bright spots of yellow in those flowers. By the way, those flowers are so much brighter in real life, and there's just the three of them up top. Like, they are so eye drawing, and that would generally be bad. We wouldn't want just like three bright spots in a random, like, all collected together in a miniature. We wouldn't want the miniature to generally be monotone, right? We wouldn't want our contrasting color to be so weak. We wouldn't want our contrast shadows to be so overblown as to just, like, again, there is no world where that vase casts that shadow, right? In reality. But it doesn't matter. So we can aspire to paint to the painting on the right, and we see miniatures that are painted like in the style of the thing on the right, where it's this beautiful, incredible, precise, technical use of color that shows an incredible skill, and that's fine. We can all aim toward that in some miniatures, but at the same time, we shouldn't be afraid to explore and to paint differently sometimes, to do things that speak to us, that break that conventional wisdom. So, because you might end up with something that really endures, or that's unique, or that's different, that's your style and your voice and your emotion and what you meant to communicate there. And I know that sounds silly and high-minded when we're just talking about painting tiny plastic people, okay? But there's no innate greater value to pigment and oil stuck on a piece of stretched canvas than there is to stuck on a piece of plastic. It's all art. And we can seek after whatever we want in it, and shouldn't be afraid to try those things that speak just to us, or maybe because you don't know in the end who else it will speak to. Some random idiot 30 years later, who was staring at a museum built to your name, who was like utterly fascinated by this piece. The random idiot's me. But so I thought it was an interesting example of how pieces that and work that doesn't fit the sort of mold of how we think can still end up being the more striking piece, the thing that presents more of a charge, at least to me. And made me think more about how bold I should try to be and what I should try to aim for in some of my experimentation when painting bravely. So there you go. As I said, this is a bit more of a philosophical one. It's more just thinking about art and the nature of what we're undertaking here and my own personal journey in it. I don't know if you will find this interesting, but I hope you do. I hope, if at the very least, you had fun staring at these very pretty pictures with me for the last 20 minutes or so. But as always, if you liked this one, hey, give it a like. Subscribe for additional hobby cheating. We normally do miniature painting tutorials here, of course, if this happens to be your first time here. and we have new videos every Saturday. But I really appreciate you watching this one and coming on this little emotional journey with me. I would love your take down in the comments of what you think. Which of these pieces speaks to you, and why, if either. So there you go. Please share. I am keenly and deeply interested in your thoughts, and very much look forward to that. But as always, I appreciate you watching this one, and we'll see you next time.